Hello everybody, what's up? It's the 27th of August. I'm Pilgrim, and today I'm in a place of calmness. I'm in a state of peace. Just leaving town, I'm driving home. I just got my hair cut actually, so I've got a weight off my mind. Ha! A weight off my mind. Anyway, I'm driving home, and I thought today, instead of shouting about some kind of fucking bullshit, and getting myself all worked up, I figured I'd just talk about something that I think is interesting, and that maybe we've spoken a little bit about on the Critical Mess podcast with all the other guys, but, you know, when there's other people, they interrupt me the whole time. I don't get to hear my voice as much as I'd like to. So here's me. Just me, no one to interrupt me. So I'm going to waffle on about something. You know, very white male. I'm just going to blah, blah, blah about something or other on the way home. And I figured I'd talk about what I see as the fundamental issue or the problem with the gaming industry. And that is, or the fundamental conflict. And as I see it, the fundamental conflict in the gaming industry is the one between publishers and developers. And it manifests itself in all sorts of different ways. And it gives rise to an awful lot of tension. There are a lot of analogies to other industries, you know, where there's a similar sort of a conflict of interest as that between developers and publishers. So I figured I'd talk about that. So for starters, what's at the root of this conflict of interest between developers and publishers? Well, and then, you know, maybe this is really obvious to lots of people. You know, maybe it isn't. Maybe it's interesting. Maybe you'll hear something for the first time. Maybe, you know, you'll hear something you don't agree with, but you'll at least learn more why people think the way they do. Or maybe you already think what I'm going to say. In which case, you get quite a nice opportunity to to hear something you agree with. You know, reinforce your worldview. That's always nice. So, yeah, what was I talking about? 2.5 minutes and I haven't even said anything. The conflict between developers and publishers. Well, the developers are the folks that make the game. They're all the nerdy guys who know how to make like graphics and write storylines and little lines of code and make the whole game go together. And the publishers are the guys whose job it is to publish it, to actually fund the production of the damn thing, to advertise it and to shift it to the public. Now those two groups of people have got presumably two different sets of motivations for doing what they do. People who work in publishing usually come from a business background, because in order to advertise things well and market them properly and sell a lot of copies, you need to be good at business. The developers, on the other hand, well, they're a bunch of happy nerds like presumably you listening. You know, they like video games. Maybe they like some kind of art style or something or other. They've got some kind of a hobby, and they develop it into a professional skill to make something creative out of, you know, whatever they've got inside their heads. And the thing they elect to create is a video game. The problem is, of course, that a lot of people who want to make video games these days especially, not so much in the old days, but these days especially, need a lot of money to make the game they're thinking of. It's not a cheap thing making a video game anymore, you know, it's up in, you know, let alone millions of dollars. Even pretty bog standard games are going into tens of millions of dollars these days. And of course then you've got the mega big games that cost even more than that. In any case, that's why you get this pairing between publishers and developers. And of course, historically, the roots of the gaming industry is a kind of nerd culture, right? I mean, and I don't mean that in a condescending way, obviously, because fuck, I'm in all this business as well. What I mean is like, it wasn't. If you compare contemporary gaming industry with where it came from, you know, the biggest difference is how mainstream gaming is today. Gaming isn't this nerdy hobby anymore, and it's not, you know, the games aren't made by really nerdy. I mean, maybe it's made by nerdy guys, but It's not made in the same. There's not this disconnect between mainstream society and gaming sort of culture. That's there's not that disconnect anymore. And what that means is when it becomes mainstream, it becomes a lot more profitable because a lot more people consume the video games. And I can say already now, I'm not going to go into some kind of elitist argument like, all of the mainstream is what has ruined video games or whatever, or that games have been dumbed down or this, that, or the other. I mean, maybe to a certain extent that's true, but to another extent it's, or on the other hand, or however you want to say it, it's good that gaming has become mainstream, because look at how far we've come in terms of the technical power to create things, and also the sort of the social or the cultural space it's been given. I mean, for heaven's sakes, you've got Mark Hamill in Star Citizen, Keanu Reeves in Cyberpunk. We had Sean Bean in Oblivion. There's a fusion between other forms of media and video games, and that's a good thing, because it's just as much, in my mind, a respectable form of media, or a respectable medium as any other. Anyway, the point I was trying to make, what the fuck was I talking about, is that back in the day you used to make a video game, it was a few guys in their basement or their garage knocking together some lines of code to make something fun, and it was, maybe they sold a few thousand copies, maybe they sold a few 10,000 copies, but it was no more than that. That's what it was. And then, as the years went by, it became a bigger and bigger industry, and that's why this need for folks who can actually market the damn things grew. That's why now you've ended up with big old publishing companies like EA and Activision and Ubisoft and whatnot, Epic, and they're the guys who are managing all of this, because the nerds on their own don't have the funding to do it. Although there are interesting exceptions, of course, where it's the same, where they do it in-house, as you say, when the same company has both a developing arm and a publishing arm. Anyway, here's the deal. The developers are a group of people who want to make a video game. And they're interested in turning whatever idea or design they had in their mind into something which is, fun, and which they're a product they can deliver to gamers. Publishers, on the other hand, they want to find groups of developers that they think are going to make a video game that's going to make a lot of money. And they are then going to fund those developers to make the game. Now, already there's a conflict of interest. Because what makes for an exciting video game, or interesting mechanics, or at least the thing that people have in their minds, what they think are interesting mechanics and interesting game design, story choices and whatnot, are not necessarily the same things that are going to sell the most copies of a video game. And that's why you have this tension between publishers saying things like, well, this game can't be this difficult, because if it's too difficult, not enough people will buy it, and we need to make money, because that's what we're at. Or they'll say, well, yes, this is an interesting theme for a game, but I think we're going to have to cut away some of this content because it's a bit too sensitive to talk about XYZ. And we don't want to have any controversy, and so that the game doesn't sell. Or it could be something like, well, this is a cool game, but there's too much cursing in it. And because there's too much cursing, it's not going to sell enough because we'll have to put an 18 plus rating on it. And for various reasons in various countries, it's therefore difficult to sell. And all these things go into the publisher's mindset, which were never in the developer's mindset, because that's not really in their interest, other than that they want to procure a good publishing deal. And this conflict is what underlies a lot of the issues in the video game industry, especially as publishing companies have become increasingly, how would you put it, aggressive in their pursuit of profit. I suppose I'll get back to that in a moment. Or in fact, why don't we just talk about that now? Because as I say, the publishing companies, they want to make a whole lot of money, and that's why they want to avoid things that might be too difficult to players, or things that are too sensitive or whatnot, or things that might compromise their sales in this place or another. And that's why, and then for this reason, when developers get funded by certain publishers, they have to adapt in certain ways. One of the ways that publishers today, and this is quite a modern phenomenon, only in, I guess, the last, the last decade, I guess, is what people today call monetization in games, or rather added monetization. The sales model of a video game. Because, of course, back in the day, a dude would make the game, or a bunch of dudes, because it was always dudes back in the day. Anyway, a bunch of folks would make the game. They'd sell it for a certain amount of money. You own the game. That's it. Have fun. But then, folks started to realize that people who still had the game, maybe they were enjoying it still, and they wanted some extra content, so you could add more stuff to the original game. So you started making expansion packs. Now, with expansion packs, you could sell again to a customer who's already bought your game. But of course, it had to be substantial enough of an expansion to warrant the added price of someone adding it to their game. But through time, that has of course become bastardized into all sorts of so-called expansions or added things into video games, that often they're basically digital, that you just download or that you buy now in little, back in the day it was an expansion pack that you buy over the internet and download an extra sort of DLC, as it's called, downloadable content. And the publishers realized that, well, actually, you can make an awful lot of money doing this. Because once you've bought a game, sometimes DLC, so, let me get my fucking thoughts straight about this. DLC that you buy like this comes in different forms. Sometimes it's an expansion pack with a new campaign or new levels or new content or whatever. And sometimes it's stuff that's kind of cosmetic. It's nice to have in the game. Maybe it gives you a stat bonus or whatnot. Maybe it doesn't. And sometimes these are known as horse armor. And they're known as horse armor because, if I recall correctly, one of the early people, folks playing around with this idea was Bethesda, when they sold horse armor, which you could buy for a few bucks. And I don't know how you got it, but you downloaded it. It was a code at first. Anyway, you download this business, and they realized, fuck, they'll pay just a few dollars to make their horse in the game look a little bit different. So those kind of cosmetic DLC became a thing. Now, through time, this was, of course, bastardized even further by EA and into the kind of loot boxes we see today. Where you pay a few bucks and you get a random item for the game. I mean, it's not just EA. I just say EA because they're some of the most egregious examples of this, being a lot of their sports games. They're like Ultimate Team and FIFA, where you pay a few bucks and you get a little pack of like players for your team, and you get a random set, and usually they're shit. And if you're very lucky, you get a good player like Ronaldo or Messi, but usually you get a bunch of shit ones. In any case, this is quite a far... This mode of selling things, as in you can buy extra stuff, a few bucks a piece, online from the store, is quite far removed from the original sense of extra content and DLC, which was, you'd pay maybe 10, 15, 20 bucks, but you'd get a sizable chunk of gameplay out of it. Now, the point I'm bringing up all this nonsense now, in this context, is because it's worth asking yourself as a gamer, and ourselves as the gaming industry or the gaming community, who is it that benefits from this, and why is it there, and who's pushed for this development? Well, it's not the developers. I mean, in a sense, they want to keep interest in their video games, but they could just do that, by adding extra content, or by making new games, or whatever. This sort of aggressive monetization you see today is clearly something pushed by publishers, because they want to make the most money possible with whatever games that they have funded. And in fact, you can see with companies like EA, they're making more money now on the sale of digital microtransactions of this sort of DLC extra content. They make even more money on that than on selling the actual games in some instances. I mean, both overall as a company they do that, but for some games they sell a wild amount of loot boxes, like with FIFA. So if they're making more money off these microtransactions than off the actual game itself, well then, from their business perspective, what becomes most important? It's the steady stream of revenue from these microtransactions. Now, when that's the case, then you start getting into really murky waters, because then you get instances like, for example, Electronic Arts publishing a game developed by DICE, Star Wars Battlefront 2. Now, this game was clearly developed by a bunch of people who definitely know what they're doing when it comes to making a first-person shooter. And I maintain to this day that the atmosphere, the feel, and the music of Star Wars Battlefront 2, to a relatively large extent, the gameplay is absolutely excellent. It's a really fun game. However, when the game came out, it was completely fucked. Because most of the characters that you could choose to play as, the different heroes, like Darth Vader, Yoda, the Emperor, or certain heroes you could be, were all locked. And you had to unlock them through gameplay. Now, that's nothing weird. That's been around since the early days of video gaming. You have to unlock more content through gameplay. But of course, what EA offered was you could pay them a few bucks and you could unlock all of that content earlier. Now, you might think, well, that doesn't, as long as you can unlock it through the game, that doesn't really matter because you're not really getting anything you couldn't otherwise have got. While that's the case, with the business interest in mind, what EA did was they made it the case that you would have to spend something like, I think it was either 40 or 80 hours, I think initially 80 and then they changed it down to 40 hours of gameplay to unlock a hero. Now that's crazy. That's like a full week's work, full time, to unlock one more hero, of which there were several in the game. No one has that kind of a time. I mean, some people do, but not the folks, not most folks. So clearly, then what happened was, lots of people paid money to unlock the heroes, and furthermore, tied into this was a progression system which relied very heavily on you unlocking loot boxes, which of course you could also buy. And of course, then from a business perspective, you want to incentivize people to buy those loot boxes. So what happened? Well, if you got those loot boxes, you can get new items for your characters, which massively increased their quality. Long story short, some effect of this was if you paid a whole load of money, you get a whole load of stuff which made you way better at the game, i.e. it became pay to win. Now, these mechanics are introduced by publishers, not by developers. Clearly this is the case. No developer thinks, you know what my game needs? Well, my game needs microtransactions. No, that's not what they think. Developers aren't concerned with that. They want to make a game where the player has fun. That's what they're doing. Of course, they need to have funding. And then you could say, well, yeah, but the developers want to have funding, so therefore they do things to give, to maximize their likelihood of getting a good publishing deal. That's fine. But the point, in fact, is that it's the publishers and the market of publishers competing for developers that have structured the industry such that the way to get a decent publishing deal and the way to get continued funding from a publisher is to make a game with microtransactions and pushing aggressively for small sales of loot boxes and so on and so forth. And by the way, I haven't even gone into the whole gambling aspect of loot boxes, but let's leave that aside for the moment, because this is about the tension and the conflict between the interests of the developer and the publisher. Now, in some instances, you can see this being resolved one way or another. There are several interesting examples. I think, for example, you can start by looking at games where the profit motive of the publishers is not necessarily through microtransactions, or rather it's not maximized through that, but where there's another incentive in selling lots of games. And an example of this that I'm thinking of is PlayStation exclusives. Because of course Sony wants to sell lots of consoles. And one way to make sure you sell lots of consoles is to have exclusive games that are really good. So in those instances, you can see that Sony have elected to maximize their income, not by making games which contain a lot of microtransactions to get a whole lot of cash out of each customer, in the way that typically EA's games have, or Blizzard, Activision Blizzard's games with cosmetics and whatnot that people can buy, or like Epic's Fortnite. But instead, they just need to make a really, really good game, or several really, really good games. And examples of this include games like God of War, Horizon Zero Dawn, The Last of Us. These are all PlayStation exclusives that have done really well. And I think this is because the profit motive from the publishers is manifest in their desire to sell consoles through generating a artistically and creatively good game, rather than generate income from a whole load of microtransactions. Another interesting thing to look at is a company like Rockstar, who both develop and publish their own games. And you can see that their single-player game, well, if you look at GTA 5 or Red Dead Redemption 2, which are two phenomenal games, the single-player aspects of these games are absolutely wonderful. And to my mind, I mean, the actual gameplay mechanics on Red Dead 2 weren't that brilliant, but the storytelling and that game is a masterpiece. Whatever, you could discuss the gameplay, but the game as a whole is a masterpiece. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is the single player in those two games are some of the best games ever made, to my mind. They're truly brilliant. The attention to detail, their scope, the storyline, the voice acting, everything is amazing. However, the multiplayer, which is designed to be a sort of, persistent thing, source of revenue for the company, fails to live up to the expectations of the single player. And it doesn't necessarily need to be the case that it is this way. Some multiplayer games are really, really good, and they can hold a candle to single player games. But the multiplayer modes of Rockstar games don't hold up to the single player modes. And I think this is because the profit motive is concentrated into the multiplayer mode. Ubisoft have been playing around with this idea that, maybe we can get players to buy cosmetics in single-player games. And to a certain extent, they've been successful, but I don't think that these Assassin's Creeds they've been doing, where you can do that, have been huge financial hits for them. But in any case, they've been playing around with this idea. But basically, people know that you can't really sell, cosmetics and gameplay boosts and everything for single-player games. For some reason, folks don't care as much about that. It's mostly for multiplayer games. And you can see this in one company, where the interest of the publishing arm conflicts with the interests of the developing arm. Because obviously, the developers of Red Dead 2 and GTA 5, I'm sure would have preferred the multiplayer aspects to have worked very differently. But instead, they were built around sales of microtransactions. In the same way, Star Wars Battlefront 2 was clearly built around the idea of selling microtransactions. And as a sort of negative contrast, or as an example where this sort of conflict is absent, I think you can look to studios which have a very strong integrity and who self-publish. And, God hope I don't have to eat my words on this, but if you look at a company like CD Projekt, and their CD Projekt Red, their developers, they've developed and published some excellent games which are not stuffed full of microtransactions. And as it seems to be the case now, Cyberpunk 2077 coming up is made by CD Projekt Red, going to be published by CD Projekt, and it looks like it's not going to be stuffed full of microtransactions, which is great. And of course, there's nothing stopping them selling microtransactions and loot boxes in that, and in fact they may well turn around and do that, but I personally don't think that they will. But the only thing that's stopping them is some sort of integrity or some different view of what a game is. And I will get back to that in just one second. The other example I was just going to say of an instance where this sort of conflict is removed is where you see kickstarted video games. Of course, there's been a lot of issues with completely or semi-fraudulent Kickstarter projects. But in general, when you kickstart a project, you're funding the developer to make something, and you're doing it, they're seeking funding directly from the end consumers, the gamers, because they want to avoid the impact of publishers who might have views about content or difficulty or, age rating or whatever, that you're deliberately avoiding that through crowdfunding. Anyway, underlying all of this, of course, and manifesting the difference between CD Projekt Red and or CD Projekt and EA, to my mind, is the question: what makes a good game? What kind of game do we want to make? Well, everyone wants to make a good game, but how do you define a good game? Now, for developers, a good game is going to be expressed, I believe, in terms of the game mechanics, the game design, the game story, the game's graphics, the game's sound, the things that the end consumer experiences. That's what makes for a good game from a developing perspective. And in fact, I think from a gamer's perspective, that's the only perspective we have. If something is neat, challenging, but possible to get good at, it's easy to learn, difficult to master, that's what makes games good. Now, from a publisher's perspective, on the other hand, a good game isn't this. A publisher isn't happy if someone makes a brilliant game if it doesn't sell. It doesn't matter how amazing the game is. If it doesn't sell well, they're not going to be happy because they are a business entity rather than a creative entity. They're in this to make money. So from a publishing perspective, God of War may well have been a success. But if God of War had only sold 50,000 copies, it would still have been a game of creative brilliance, and it would have been a brilliant game from a developer's perspective. But from a publisher's perspective, it would have been a failure. And this really highlights, I think, this conflict. It highlights where the disagreements and the tension arises between developers and publishers, because publishers are interested in selling games, but developers are interested in making interesting games. Now, a lot of the time when we're discussing things on the Critical Mess, we sort of stretch around this topic or scrape along the top of it, because it's very difficult to get your whole hand around the root of it, and really muck around with this issue, like I'm trying to do now. But that's fundamentally what the problem is, because when we're pissed off about microtransactions, or when I'm pissed off about microtransactions and cosmetics changes going into games, this is the thing I'm annoyed with. It's because those decisions to include those were not made to make a good game from a developing or from an end consumer's perspective. They were made to make a game good from a publishing and a corporate sense. And I don't think that's what makes a good game good. And in fact, it's not strange I don't think that, because the only people who think that are the publishers. But herein lies the absolute central problem with the industry today. The people with most control are the publishers. So the games that usually end up being made, or rather, the games that end up being made by financially powerful entities and publishers, are games which are good from a publishing perspective, but not necessarily good from a developing perspective. And of course, you could make the argument, well, listen here, Pilgrim, games will sell well if they are good, and those two things are aligned. But I don't agree with that. I don't think it's true that you will automatically make lots of money from a good game design, or that you will automatically not make lots of money from bad game design. For example, look at the mobile game industry. No one thinks that the mobile game industry has good game design. Usually it revolves around you clicking on a button and waiting a certain amount of time before you can click it again. But if you pay them money, you can click the button more often. Now, that's not good game design in my book, nor do I think it's good game design in very many developers' books. But from a publishing perspective, that's fucking brilliant game design. Minimal maintenance costs, minimal design costs, and yet you can rake in a shit ton of cash. So with that example, I'm trying to show that to my mind, and I think, in fact, objectively, I don't just think it's my perspective, I think objectively, the interests of publishers and developers are not aligned, and good game design doesn't necessarily correlate with high income. I gotta go into the shop now, but if I can think of more shit to talk about when I come out, you better believe I'm going to talk more at this thing here. Bye for now. Hello again, I just came out of the shop, and I was just trying to think what I wanted to say, and I think I've forgotten what the fuck I was talking about. But anyway, you see, it takes a long time to talk about this kind of thing, because it's not, in a way it's a straightforward topic, because you could just TLDR it saying, well, publishers want to make money, but developers want to make good games. But you sort of need to explore this kind of thing a little bit more, and look at it from different perspectives. And one of the perspectives I think I mentioned briefly when I started waffling about this shit is that there are other industries which of course have similar problems. This conflict between folks who want to create basically what you would call art, I guess. Not everyone calls video games art, but I think it's fair to call them a sort of an art. This is sort of a work of creativity. There's people who want to create like that, and then there's people who want to make money from the creation of that stuff. Now, that's a conflict that isn't only restricted to the video games industry. You've got, in the music industry, I'm sure that This is the problem, because of course I know fuck all about all these other industries, but I'm sure that in the music industry and in the sort of TV and the film industry, there's the exact same tension and conflict of interest. You have this creative aspirations that folks have; they want to make something, but then I guess what sometimes is called like the realism, or the realistic perspective, the real world comes into the question. Well, yeah, but we got to sell this. We got to make money from it. It costs money to make a movie, so we got to make money. And then, if we want to make money from making the movie, then I'm afraid you can't have it treat this topic. Well, then you can't use this kind of language, and you get all these effects in movies as well, and in TV shows. And then there's all sorts of other issues arising from this conflict. You can also look at books. I work in science, so the analogy that's closest for me to think about is popular science. Now, in popular science, of course, you have a similar kind of conflict. If you want to make a pop science book, you will want to treat a topic a certain way. And I don't mean like you need that, popular scientists want to treat things at a very high level, and people who read popular science aren't at the same level as scientists, because, in a way, of course, that's true, but that's not really the point I'm trying to make. What I mean is that there's going to be a certain interest from a publisher to make the book sell, and that isn't always aligned with good science or even a good popular science account of a scientific issue. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is, whenever you have a relationship between creator and publisher, you have this conflict, and you could look in other industries, like in publishing books, in movies and so on. Obviously in music, with like record labels trying to tell their artists what they can do and what they can't do, and trying to control them in different ways. And this is an age-old problem. The interesting thing, I think, in this context about video games is this is quite a young medium, and we're still, to my mind, at the stage of development of this industry that it's not impossible to alter the direction it takes. Because you could make a pretty good argument that, like, yeah, there's this conflict today exists between extremely rich, powerful book publishers and authors. But there's not much you can do to change that, because that's just the structure of the industry today. And of course you could set about trying to change that if you wanted to, but it wouldn't be an easy task. But it's still a fair point that someone might make, that but that's the structure of the industry, and it's you have to find your place in it, and you can't really change it. But the interesting thing about the video game industry, to my mind, is that we could change it, in fact. We're still in the very early stages. It's still a very young industry, and the decisions of the community, both of gamers but also of developers, and of course publishers, of today, is what's going to define it moving forwards, and it's what's going to give it its structure. And I think that my perspective as a consumer of games, as a gamer, is to look at other industries where this conflict has sort of not been managed very well, where there clearly is this tension between creator and publisher, and look at that and then relate it to gaming and think, well, that's not actually what I want for gaming. I don't think that is the best way of doing things. And that's why I'm personally so excited about crowdfunding, because I think that it quite neatly circumvents this whole issue. It just takes one big step to the side and says, no, we're going to avoid this whole conflict by just not including publishers. We're just going to straight up fund our games by gamers. And of course that introduces its own problems. I've backed Star Citizen. You don't need to tell me that it has its own issues of crowdfunding something because of, feature creep or misrepresentation or whatever you want to say. Don't get me wrong, I'm completely on board with Star Citizen. I think the game's going to be amazing. I just mean that there are legitimate arguments you can make that introduces its own problems. Nevertheless, I'm still interested in crowdfunding in the context of this publisher-developer dichotomy, conflict, whatever. Because it's a way of circumventing it. And I'm not saying that's the final best solution for the problem to avoid it, but just there must be some way that this new 21st century industry can avoid the problems that have beleaguered other industries, like book publishing and, the movie industry and the music industry. It just feels like if we take this seriously as a gaming community and actually look at the structure of how games are funded, how they are developed, which things influence their design, and content and how they're consumed, we could do better than just slowly sliding into the same model that defines all these other industries. Because I think that this division, that this conflict of interest between developers and publishers actually negatively impacts game quality. Of course, there are instances where the effect of a publisher might have been healthy. I mean, then I'm thinking like, I've just parked in my drive, but I'm just going to finish my fucking thought. Of course, there's instances where the publisher's contribution to the game development might be to focus the developers into avoiding feature creep, whatever. I'm thinking, for example, of Mount & Blade, the first game that was developed by Tailworlds but published by Paradox. You could sort of see there that the publisher wanted to get the game out, but the developers were sort of feature creeping their game. And I think that you can see this even more when you look at Mount & Blade 2, which is being self-published by Tailworlds. And it's quite clear, to me at least, that they've let development spiral a lot without that that exercise of control from a publisher who's trying to rein them in and get them focused on the product they want to make and avoiding, expanding the scope too much and just getting it out the door. Now, I can see that that's good in certain instances, but for the most part, it seems to me that the impact of publishers is negative because it affects game design in a negative way. I mean, you could take something like one of the games me and Steve always go on about how much we loved / hated is For Honor. We fucking loved For Honor. We played it to death. But you can't deny that that game was broken. And one of the many ways in which it was broken was that whenever they released new characters, which you either had to, which you had to buy with steel, which was an in-game currency you could either earn or buy, those characters were always way too powerful before they had their first balancing pass several months in. Now, it's easy to see why that's the case, because they want people to buy those new characters, and preferably the publisher wants you to spend money doing so. And I think if that motive for profit wasn't there in the same way, that wouldn't be, you won't see this sort of feature creep. I mean, it's like Hearthstone. Hearthstone is such a perfect example because you've got cards. I don't know if you play Hearthstone or whatever, but the cards in Hearthstone have got different stats. And sometimes they have special words that give them a certain power or whatever. And sometimes there'll be a new card come out with exactly the same stats as an old card, except now it also has a special word of power or whatever. Like, it'll also do taunt, or it'll also have charge. Now, that's just that's just power creep. That's all that is. Because, if it was a balance issue, then the card would already have been better. That's just power creep. And power creep is there because it wants to incentivize people to buy the new card packs to get the new cards. That's sort of how the Hearthstone model works. Now, from a publisher perspective, that's brilliant. But from the gamer's perspective, it's pretty shit because it makes the game less balanced. And of course, you might think I'm naive saying that, well, if it was just down to the developers, you wouldn't have these issues. And maybe, some developers make these kind of things, introduce these issues themselves through poor design choices. And of course, developers have to make money themselves. But I don't think that developers need to make as much money as publishers need to make. I don't think that's the same kind of interest. They're not in it for the same reason. Like, if you look at Fortnite, that made, what was that number we were tossing around in the Critical Mess podcast a while ago? That made, was it $3 billion? Is that how much it made? Or was that Epic as a whole that made it? Well, that's basically Fortnite. Now, they made that much money. Like, you don't need to make that much money to maintain a game like Fortnite. You're only doing that because you're in the business of making money, not of making games. And, then you can go into the whole, this is a hallmark of the capitalist society, and that's a bigger political talk for another day. I just feel like you don't need to make as much money from a game as you do from, FIFA's Ultimate Team cards or Fortnite's cosmetics. And, also, I think if you look at that money coming into EA from FIFA's Ultimate cards and you think that's going back to the developers who made the game, then I think you're a bit confused. Because that's not what's happening. It's like Apex Legends. You think the cosmetics that are being introduced now, you think all the money that they're selling, all the money that they're making from these season 2 loot boxes and cosmetic, basically loot boxes. Well, all this money they're making from the cosmetics from season 2, you think that's going back to the developers, to the salary of the people making the game? No, it's going up to EA. That's where the money's going. So it's not in the developers' interest to behave like this either. It's only the publishers. Anyway, man, I could talk for another 15 minutes because I haven't even gotten into how Epic fits into this whole stuff. But long story short, they're complete shits. Because they claim that they're trying to be on the side of the little indie devs, but of course they only want to help indie developers market their game if they give an exclusivity deal. Well, that's bad for the indie developer because they want to sell their game. They're not championing the rights of indie developers by only offering it. I mean, that's that game. What was it called? Dark with a Q. Isn't that the game that they offered that they offered the exclusivity deal to? Dark said no, and they were like, "Hey, sorry, well, then we won't ship your game from our marketplace." They didn't have the interests of those developers at heart. They only had their own interests at heart because they wanted to make an exclusivity deal, because they wanted to attract people to their marketplace. That's what they want to do. It's such bullshit. It's such corporate doublespeak what Epic are doing, saying that they're helping, indie developers, because they're just a publisher like anyone else. They're just, and in fact, they're more aggressive. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. What a long fucking talk about nothing. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to go now because I'm boiling in my car. The end.